Gray stone flaked from the wall of Lenore's chamber. Picking up the mineral, once so strong but now worn, she made it crumble between two fingers and fall onto the midnight purple gown caressing her body. A dull excitement of the weakest rebellion briefly intoxicated her. A dusty dress certainly didn't fit the perfect image she was supposed to uphold. An airy breath bounced between the dreary walls, and she looked around, her fingers still pinched together from demolishing the chipped rock. It seemed to dance around her, disorienting her senses of the sound's true direction. Leaving her chamber, she wandered the long, labyrinth-like halls lighted only by the flickering candles inside their weathering sconces, challenging the castle's otherwise upkept appearances. Ahead of her, the tomb-like hall carried the whispers like they were fog. A deceitful uncertainty lay within them, just waiting for something to pop out. Her next turn led her into a completely darkened passage. She continued down the dark corridor, the murmurs growing ever distant as the silence engulfed her. Soon, she reached a lighted hallway. After a few more twists of the castle's halls, the quiet was interrupted by a distant melody. Nearing the east wing, she witnessed a rat scurry off with its lucky haul from the event happening in the ballroom. Entering the wing, her mother and father waited for her. Events such as these created the illusion of grand leisure. Little did the village know that the castle was anything but luxurious, and Lenore definitely did not live the life the villagers thought her to have. From the hall, she saw guests twirling, their gowns and coats seemingly merging as if the dance made them one. "You're late," her mother said. Elizabeth Devlin was just as desperate to appear happy as she was to leave the castle. "Doesn't matter?" Lenore asked. "Lenore," her father, Rupert, warned tenderly. A wisp of sickening breath cooled Lenore's ear, and she straightened. These walls had imprisoned her and her family far too long. They were promised after one more favor in Lenore's 17th year that they'd be set free. The whispers had followed her all week and strengthened that morning. The favor would be asked soon. She felt it, and it would have to be done discreetly in a crowd so large. She tried not to fret upon it. "The last one," Rupert said, trying to provide comfort, but he wasn't the one to hand over a life. Lenore had done so once a year since she was 10 years old. Tonight would be the last. She thought of refusing countless times. She didn't want to be damned, but if she didn't do what was asked of her, her parents would suffer. Her mother always told her that God would have mercy, that he wouldn't put such a burden on a child with no forgiveness in the afterlife. Lenore pretended to believe her. "You say that as if it means nothing," Lenore said to Rupert. Neither Rupert nor Elizabeth contradicted her. After her third victim, they hid their tears and worry for Lenore well. But each time a wind iced the castle, they tensed, fearing her presence and the death that followed. Lenore hugged her father, soothing her parents with a smile. Inside the ballroom, she made pleasantries with the guest. Some she recognized, some she did not. She tired quickly of the chatting and ingenuine laughter, but she kept that smile, even through sore cheeks. Across the room, a young man caught her eye. He conversed with a gentleman who looked to be his counterpart, only 20 years his elder. She assumed it to be his father. The young man casually looked past her before his eyes snapped back and locked with hers. She'd never met anyone at these parties worth noticing. They were usually a dull affair, but the young man had a confidence about him, and even more importantly, he seemed unfazed by the event at large. The young man grinned. A genuine smile crept over Lenore's face before she looked away and continued to mingle. The red wine inside her brass goblet reminded her of the time she was 13, when she pretended to be ill to lure a man to the castle. He was a nice man. His golden hair appeared to hold the sun as she looked above while he carried her in his arms. She couldn't recall what happened once they entered the castle, but they'd somehow managed to make it to the garden. One moment he held her, and the next his golden hair was darkened by sweat, and the gold ring on his finger reflected the sun while bathing in a thick pool of his own blood. "A woman shouldn't drink alone," said a man twice Lenore's age. Observing the room full of strangers, Lenore forced a smile and said, "I'm not alone." "Well, no, not anymore." he said with scheming eyes. A laugh escaped her. An astute observation. Tell me, Miss Devlin, your parents hold this event each year. Has no man caught your attention? Lenore's smile remained through uninterested eyes. None so far. Perhaps you should aim for practicality rather than romance, if that's so. Give attention to those who can provide for you, the man said. Lenore's gaze pierced so deeply that she felt heat in her eyes. Sir, you seem to be under the impression that the sole purpose of this event is to find me a suitor. I am sorry to tell you that you are sorely and embarrassingly mistaken. The man caught his breath. Lenore imagined him holding back unkind remarks. Have a good evening, miss, he said, touching the small of her back as he walked away. Lenore rolled her eyes and drank from her goblet. A woman shouldn't drink alone, came another voice from behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with a handsome young man. You saw that encounter and thought it worthy of a second try? I figured it'd aid in my favor when accompanied with my irresistible charm. You're going to try that again with charm? He smiled and took a step back near the wall. You don't seem to enjoy these parties. What brought you to that conclusion? She asked, restoring her typical smile and stepping closer to him and away from the crowd. Aside from the way you nearly lost your eyes to the inside of your skull from rolling them with such ferocity, you haven't held a conversation for more than 2 minutes with anyone outside of your parents. You've been watching me? Lenore asked, unsure if she should be flattered. I'm quite bored myself. I've been observing many people. For example, Mr. Thompson, the gentleman you spoke to moments ago, has been making conversation with any lady 15 to 20 years his junior. The young man tipped up his head at a group of young women. Mr. Thompson laughed a boisterous laugh, and the women engaged with much enthusiasm. Anne, lucky for him, the blonde forcing laughter so absurdly, has introduced herself to just about every wealthy man in this room. And then there's Mr. Brown, who has been eating countless plates just to pocket the utensils. Lenore jerked her head in the direction of Mr. Brown. And there he was, the village miscreant, taking a small plate with pudding of some sort, scanning his perimeter suspiciously before pocketing a spoon. It's not even real silver, she said. Then he's about to have some very disappointing barters in the near future, the man said. Are you going to tell me your name? Lenore asked. Fitzgerald. He offered his hand. Lenore shook it. Lenore Devlin. Before their hands parted, Lenore heard the familiar, haunting breath, and the candles in the ballroom blinked. She and Finn looked above with the rest of the crowd. Perhaps someone should check the windows, Finn suggested. Perhaps, Lenore said. Would you like to leave the ballroom? She knew the time was coming, but she wanted at least some good memories to come from the night. Lead the way, Finn said. As she led them through the ballroom, the breath followed like a hazy whisper. Her name was broken up through layered echoes. When and who? She asked in her mind, and the murmur stopped. Her heart settled as they exited the ballroom. Just outside the castle, she grabbed some matches and a lantern, lighting it before entering through the garden gate. The green hedges towered above both Lenore and Finn, dimming the world around them, aside from the lantern. Handing Finn the lantern, Lenore struck another match, lighting lamps scattered across the garden as they progressed through the hedges and groupings of flowers. The lamps gave the illusion of tiny fairies lighting their way. They stopped by a collection of foxgloves, a variety of purples, pinks, whites, and yellows, beautifully mixed in a way only nature could unintentionally create. Lenore hung the lantern from a garden hook and sat on a greenish cast-iron bench. This is awfully secluded, Finn said, taking a seat next to her. I wanted to see if you were just as intriguing when you didn't have a room full of subjects to observe, Lenore said. I can solve that for you now. The answer is no. Finn laughed. What a pity, Lenore said, enchanted. May I ask who maintains the garden? Finn asked. Preston and Albert are the main gardeners. I don't know them very well, she admitted, a bit ashamed. She made sure not to interact much with the male help since their trusted chef fell victim to the castle's will. Entirely new workers were appointed soon after. Well, they've done a marvelous job, Finn said. When I was young, I was obsessed with the idea of fairies. The good kind. I didn't believe in the bad ones. My father built these stone lamps, and my mother would plant flowers around them, so that when I'd come out at night, I'd think fairies were living in the garden. This has always been a calming place for me, Lenore said, shockingly not feeling the slightest bit silly, sharing such a precious memory with a stranger. Where are these fairies now? Finn asked. They were removed when the cluster of lilies caught fire, Finn laughed. Your turn. Tell me something about yourself. It can be personal or something utterly unremarkable, Lenore said. Now, hang on. Before we get into me, what stopped you from believing in the bad fairies? Lenore never questioned why until now. I guess I wanted to believe the world was beautiful, she said. Now she believed in the wicked and the ugly, even more than the good and the lovely. The castle had ruined her perception of beauty. It doesn't seem difficult when you've grown up here, Finn said, lacking harsh judgment. He truly seemed to only be making an observation. This place is equally as hideous as it is beautiful, Lenore assured him. Is there somewhere else you'd rather live? He asked, intrigued. Anywhere, really. Is that so? I suppose you think I'm privileged? Lenore said, fully aware of the way she came across. I think you sound unhappy, he said, and Lenore thought it was a fine save. So why don't you leave? Complex reasons, Lenore said. Finn nodded. Okay, so you can't leave. How would you make this place less hideous? I thought it was your turn to share, Lenore said, politely shifting the conversation. I grew up in the village, not wealthy nor poor. I have a sister and 2 brothers. One disappeared 4 years ago. He was the eldest. And I never believed in fairies. Finn smiled. Lenore, the entity called to her in a serpentine manner. The sweep of a black dress caught her eye, disappearing behind a hedge. Would you like to go back inside? It's getting a bit chilly, Lenore asked. Back in the ballroom, the orchestra played another song, and Finn guided Lenore in a dance that led to multiple dances. The whole time, Lenore felt the entity's presence and waited for its instructions. She managed to giggle through her perturbation thanks to Finn's charming company. The way his hands respectfully held her waist awakened feelings of giddy delight. Maybe, Lenore thought, she could find him again once morning came. She could get to know him properly, even if nothing became of it. But at least she could do so without fear. Then, a wisp of the tail of a black gown weaved between the crowd. No body seemed to accompany it, nor did the gown have a top half to complete it. As Lenore and Finn moved in a synchronized motion, the black dress grew with each view. Lenore's feet lifted from the floor as Finn spun her around. Reorienting herself, she witnessed the black gown's tail had grown into a complete skirt. Another spin, a full dress, flowing and elegant in its movement. A sheer top rested over a dense, shadowy fabric. Another spin. This time, a pale arm hung by the dress, and long, blood-red nails popped in comparison to the porcelain skin. The figure vanished behind Mr. Thompson. It will be him, Lenore thought, watching Mr. Thompson parading around a woman young enough to be his daughter. Another spin. The black dress zipped behind another guest. Platinum hair streamed in the air, in stark contrast with the dress. Lenore and Finn continued twirling. The features of his face appeared clouded as Lenore's thoughts lost themselves to the dark dress and extraordinary light blonde hair. The whispers grew so loudly that they made her head spin more than the dance, but the words were knotted and unclear. The music stopped, and the merry-go-round of the ballroom stilled. Lenore's heart dropped. Behind Finn stood her, whatever she was, her gown mourning yet seductive, and her hair falling perfectly to her waist. But her face was far from beautiful. Her hollow cheeks looked as though the fat had been sucked out of them, and her hooded eyes were a shade of blue so pale they were nearly white. Obscenely blue veins dressed her chest and neck. Her red-painted lips were thin and cracked. Finn. Gerald. She spoke clearly, with a pronounced breath between his first and surname. No, Lenore said, in a breath that matched the woman's. Pardon? Finn asked. The creature did not repeat his name. Instead, Her ghostly eyes lingered on Lenore. Aware of Finn's eyes on hers, Lenore couldn't tear hers from the woman, if one could call her that. Lenore shook her head, solidifying her answer. The woman's lips twitched, and Lenore thought of her parents. In horror of her victim of choice, Lenore had forgotten the consequences. Her eyes widened as the monstrous thing lifted its hand, and as if sped up, reached for Lenore. Within half a second, Lenore felt a cruel, cold hand around her wrist. In an instant, Lenore went from the bright and bustling ballroom to a dark corridor. It smelled of rot, and her feet were wet. As she stepped forward through the water, grainy debris sunk into her heels, traveling between her toes. Her breath and the shifting of water were the only sounds. Without light, she couldn't recognize which part of the castle she resided, but it wasn't familiar, nor up to par with the rest of the fortress. "Mother? Father?" Lenore called, stopping in hopes of receiving an answer. When her parents' voices were not found, she called for Finn. Only the disappointing echo of her own voice bounced back to her. Since she could see nothing, she reached her hand out to the side, stepping sideways until the cold stone rested beneath her palm. Suddenly, as if by magic, she appeared in another passage, her palm touching a brand new wall. The water had gone, but the grit remained fixed to her feet. This time, the start of the corridor was illuminated by moonlight. Shadows shaped like diamonds refracted through the window and onto the floor. She knew every inch of this fortress, and the window did not match any design she'd seen in all her years. The shape, sure, but its edges were too precise. What happened to her parents? And Finn? Had she killed them all? What would she, that thing, do to Lenore? The moonshine gave room for little light. She could not see where the passage ended. Walking further into the dark, a shuffle of high-heeled strides staggered behind her. Lenore turned toward the lighted way, but saw nothing. She turned back to the darkness, listening for her parents or Finn. She did not believe she was in any part of the castle's true structure, rather hidden away inside something created by the malevolence that haunted Devlin Castle. She was certain that evil was a demon. From toadstool homes and grasses green, a fairy's mind is ever keen. They'll watch your dreams and give you light, for when your fears are lost tonight, you'll need only to seek their eyes. They act as lanterns, shining bright. Lenore thought of the nursery rhyme on a loop. Her parents taught it to her as a way of coping with her fear of the dark as a child. It offered little comfort now. Another shuffle sent a tremble down her spine. Turning again, she saw no hint of movement. Keeping her eyes in the direction of the window, she slowly walked backwards. When the moonlight faded from view, she turned back to face the darkness and wondered if the corridor had an end. A scraping came from behind, like nails against glass. Lenore sped up, her heels clinking on the floor. She screamed when she walked directly into somebody who didn't even sway at the sudden impact. Turning to run back to the light, she knew the demon was on her heels. She couldn't outrun her, but her survival instinct pushed her forward. But she stopped when the pitch-black corridor was replaced by the kitchen. Hanging from the rafters was the Devlin chef from years gone by. His lower jaw hung vertical, nearly ripped clean off, and exposing each one of his top teeth. Blood dripped, imitating the ticking of a clock. Though Lenore had done her best to block out the memory, there was no escaping the sight before her. The man she murdered by proxy. Commotion from the barroom sounded from afar, and Lenore, thinking she could reach someone, ran from the kitchen. But when she did, she found herself on the opposite end of the castle. Walking toward her was a man with unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. Though she didn't know his name, she recognized him. Only, unlike the chef, he looked fully alive. As impossible as that was, he was the first man she led to their death. It still wounded her to think of. She was in the village when the demon told her he'd be the one. Standing behind him and whispering his name as the poor man tried exchanging the very shoes on his feet for bread. Being so young, Lenore didn't know how to go about it. The soul had to be delivered by a willing accomplice, so the demon couldn't just take him then and there. When she told her parents, her mother devised a plan for a party, and they invited the unfortunate man. Lenore invited him. When she did, she told him to arrive at the castle, and that once there he could eat as much food as he pleased. 2 days after the invitation had been cast, the man arrived at the castle with his 2 daughters. Lenore offered to show him the kitchen, as his children were entertained by the dazzle of the ballroom, but instead, she led him to a far-off corridor, the one she stood in now. The man passed her as if she were nothing, and walked around the corner. Lenore ran after him. Turning the corner, Lenore somehow ended up in the garden. Her heart beat aggressively. Growing in a cluster of flowers was a light identical to the ones from her childhood, like the ones that had been removed. She knew exactly where she was. She was on the side of the garden furthest from the exit. As she carefully made her way through the hedge maze, she passed lanterns shimmering from behind the blooms, just as they used to. Finn. Lenore froze. The voice sounded like her own. Again, the hedges seemed to echo his name. Finn, Finn, Finn. Stop! She screamed, running toward the voice, but it continued. Stop! She yelled once more. Finn's name bounced from hedge to hedge and flower to flower. Desperate to get away, she turned a corner. Lenore? She stopped, and so did the repetition of his name. Finn? She asked, unsure if it was him or a ghost. He looked terrified, and she wondered if the castle played tricks on him as well. As relieved as she was to see him, her parents were still nowhere to be found. Their surroundings went dark, save for the night sky. All the lanterns had gone out. Have you seen my parents? Lenore asked. But Finn's attention had been pulled elsewhere. His frightened eyes transformed to disbelief and shock. John? He said, staring past Lenore. Lenore looked at what held his attention, and her heart sank at the sight of another soul lost to the castle. The man with golden hair, whose kindness was repaid with death, walked from behind a hedge. The memory of a blood-stained hand flashed through Lenore's head. John! Finn said again, running after him. Lenore followed, tugging Finn's arm. Finn, it's the castle. It's her. She's playing tricks on you. No one is there. Who? Finn asked, but continued after John. Again, Lenore tried stopping him, but Finn kept walking, calling after the man. How do you know him? Lenore asked. That's my brother. Lenore stopped, watching Finn pass the pristine-clipped rose bushes. Brother? Because of her, his family had been torn apart. Did she really have to choose between doing it again or losing her own? That's not your brother. She hurried after him. Catching onto his coattails, they were transported back inside the castle, into another corridor. A single candle sputtered in its bracket, threatening to leave them in complete darkness. What's happening? Finn asked, wildly scanning the hall. They stepped over cracked granite, letting Lenore know that once again, this was not her castle. John? Finn called. He's dead, Lenore blurted out. Finn froze and turned to her. What did you just say? Softer, Lenore repeated herself. I just saw him, Finn said, refusing the truth. Lenore shook her head and took a breath. That man you saw died in the garden 4 years ago. Finn stared in distrust. I'm sorry, Lenore said. She couldn't bring herself to tell him it was because of her, but she owed him an apology at the very least. Finn's eyes looked past her, widening as he took a step back. What the hell is that? Lenore turned. The demon's gaunt frame stood at the edge of the candle's halo, waiting for Lenore to willingly relinquish Finn. Reaching out her hand, as if it were a desperate plea, the demon opened her mouth. Without warning, she rushed towards them, the tip of her shoes barely dragging the ground as she seemed to float in the air. Lenore and Finn ran. It took a few moments for Lenore to realize that Finn had taken her hand, as though to protect her, and an overwhelming guilt interrupted her panic. She couldn't hand him over, but she couldn't allow her parents to die either. What could she do? They stumbled when the castle changed yet again. This part of the castle did exist, but Lenore wondered if she was actually in it or just trapped inside her own mind. Every sconce on the wall held a lit candle. The demon was gone. Finn tightly held onto her hand, and she wanted to tell him there was no need to protect her, that she didn't deserve it. But fear overruled her. Walking the corridor, she noticed the passageway in the wall, almost hidden by the illusion of the design, and an eerie sensation overtook her as they passed. She felt the demon's breath hit her ear, and she gasped, turning her head. But there was nothing. "Are you all right?" Finn asked. Lenore nodded, and they continued. The whole time a creeping sensation loomed behind them. "How do you know my brother is dead?" Finn asked. The sound came slowly. Lenore peeked behind her shoulder, and another one of her ghosts was right behind her, and strolled by as though he saw nothing. His head bled. Finn let out a cry of surprise and froze as the man passed. Lenore's eyes were stuck on the back of the phantom's head. Then, she and Finn tore their eyes from the bleeding man and collectively, slowly, walked backward. 5 other men walked their way, all unseeing, including the chef, his mouth still ripped off its hinges. And John. Finn froze at the sight of his brother. Cut nearly in half at the waist, the ghost held himself together. Too shocked to speak, Finn watched as John passed. Tears threatened to spill from Finn's eyes, and Lenore saw the pain she caused up close. Before Finn could even process his shock, they were ripped from the hall and stood in another, one that led to a balcony, one that Lenore's parents stood on. The demon stood behind them, with a hand on each of their shoulders. "Mother, Father." Lenore ran toward them, but stopped when the demon cut Rupert with her fingernail, bringing her blood-stained finger to her lips and licking it clean. "Please," Lenore begged, the demon's icy eyes fixated on her. She took a few steps forward, past Rupert and Elizabeth, letting Lenore know that she could not get to them. "What do you want?" Finn asked. The demon turned her ghostly face toward him, her cracked lips parted before looking at Lenore. Lenore silently pleaded with her. The demon waited, challenging her, and then turned back to Rupert and Elizabeth. "No, wait!" Lenore cried. The demon expectantly, greedily, turned to Lenore. Lenore knew she wanted a life. Her parents' frightened and desperate faces waited for her to do as she's always done. But when she looked at Finn, his confused horror stirred even more shame. How could she destroy his family, not once, but twice? She could think of only one alternative. "Me," she said. "Have me." "No!" Elizabeth yelled. "Lenore, what are you doing?" Rupert asked. Lenore couldn't bear to look at her parents. "You can have me," Lenore repeated. She knew she was giving up her life, but she didn't know what that meant for her soul. Did it matter if she was already damned? She stared at the evil that haunted her all these years, and wondered why it took her so long to offer up herself. What were all those deaths for? But as she accepted what she had done, she was left breathless when the demon shook her head, stepping towards her family. "Why? Why?" Now tears ran down Lenore's cheeks, but the demon did not answer. Panic took over as Lenore ran forward, hands clasped together, begging, "No, no, 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 please, please." Lenore fell to her knees in front of the demon. Finn was already behind her, grabbing her arm to pull her away. "What are you doing?" he asked in a panic. Lenore knew he didn't understand, but she harshly shrugged him off. "Choose," the demon said in her hushed voice. Rupert and Elizabeth watched in terror. Lenore must seem ungrateful for the decision to be so difficult. Her staggered breaths filled the corridor. This wasn't the work of her alone. Her parents had been complicit all these years. It was them who arranged the first cover-up, just so they could steal a struggling man from his children. It was them who repeated the party year after year so that they remained in good faith with the villagers. They encouraged her to save Lenore's life and their own. "Okay," Lenore said, wiping her tears as she stood. She turned to Finn. How she admired his charm and the bravery he presented now. Most people would have run. "Lenore," Elizabeth said nervously, looking at her parents. They almost looked like they'd given up. Their bodies were as slack as hers, looking at the woman in her cold eyes. Lenore said, "I give you Finn Gerald." "What?" Finn said, stunned. At the same time, her parents breathed a sigh of relief, and the demon rushed to Finn. Lenore looked away, and in a flash, she and her parents were returned to the ballroom, but not before hearing Finn's anguished cry. Standing by the wall, where she'd spoken to Finn earlier that evening. Her feet were no longer wet, and the grit that had irritated them was gone. Her heart pounded as tears puddled at the bottom of her face. The ballroom was as lively as ever, and the presence that followed her for 7 years lifted. Relief accompanied her sadness. Lenore didn't know if she and her family were just as evil as the demon for their part in it all. But in that moment, it didn't seem to matter. Lenore Devlin and her parents were free to leave the castle.